This video was sponsored by Squarespace.
A cold mist rolls in. Port bow! Port bow! Mermaid off the port bow! Oh jeez! It's a nor'eastern! Hold on! Hold on! Whoa! Iceberg! Iceberg! Right ahead! Hey, somebody? There's an iceberg up there. What was that? What was that?
Must be careful. Don't want to wind up in Davy Jones's locker.
Is it Davy Jones or Danny Jones? Davy?
Davy Jones's locker.
Anchors away, my dears. Anchors away. Red skies this morning. We must be on the lookout. Move the giblet crank and wax the mollies. Top notch, easterly bound.
What? Can a guy practice? In case you haven't been following along with this project, let's review. I started out by getting in the river, realizing I needed a boat, grabbing some plywood, hooking that plywood together. Then I cut the plywood into some shapes that looked like a boat. I built some ribs to stick between the plywood. I stuck the ribs between the plywood, and I had this kind of boat-shaped thing. Then I took some more pieces of wood that were shorter, I made them longer, I stretched them around to make some chines, I smeared some glue on those chines, and I put a bottom on the boat. Then I screwed the bottom into the boat, and I smoothed it out so that it kind of looked nicer. Then I put a bow cover on the front of the boat, I covered up all my screws with some chine battens, and I plugged all my holes to cover up the fact I used a million screws and flush cut the plugs. Then I flipped it over, and that's where we left off, with this boat-shaped piece of plywood. But it's not really that pretty. Let's see if we can make it prettier. All right, ready? And go. From the moment I inserted my ribs into the plywood frame, I had really wanted to trim down my ribs. But I couldn't do that until I got my interior and exterior handrails in place. So I started out by milling down some long pieces of wood that I had glued up in my previous scarfing adventure in the last video. And I first just clamped it to the side of the boat to make sure it would bend. But I needed to cut some angles to make sure that it, fit nicely against my bow stem cover thing. So I took a scrap piece that was the same dimension, roughly, as my handrail, and just clamping it to the side, I transferred the angle of my bow stem onto this scrap piece of wood and cut it on the miter saw, just to make sure I had my angle exactly right before I cut my actual handrail piece. Ah, yeah, I like the looks of that. Once I was sure I had my angle just right, I added a roundover to two sides of my exterior handrail. You could also call this a gunnel or a gun wall, but the plans say handrail, so I will be referring to it as a handrail. Then I took it over to my contractor miter saw and I cut the final angle. I had to use this saw because the piece was so long it wouldn't fit on my normal miter station. Next, I needed to glue the handrail onto the outside of the boat. Learning from my past mistakes with gluing, I first wet in the piece with some thinned down epoxy, and then I made some thickened epoxy with that colloidal silica, that powder stuff, and I put it on top of the thinned down epoxy. Then just very carefully and slowly, I started at the bow of the boat, making sure my angle was nice and tight against that bow stem cover, and I just started adding clamps, slowly working my way along the exterior of the boat until I had the entire outside handrail clamped just below the plywood. I wanted it just below the plywood because I can easily sand through the plywood to bring it flush with that exterior handrail. Then I cleaned up the entire thing with an acetone-soaked rag just to get rid of any of that pesky epoxy squeeze out. And after waiting a good 4 or 5 hours, I removed all of my clamps and it was glued nice and securely to the exterior of my boat. I then did the exact same thing on the other side. Why didn't I just do both of them at the same time, you ask? Well, believe it or not, boat building is the one time that I found myself without enough clamps. I had to put so many flippin' clamps on the outside of this thing that I just couldn't do both sides at the same time. So after I finished one side, I took all the clamps I used on that side and moved over to the other side. See? That's a crazy amount of clamps. There's one every like 2 inches. So yeah, a lot of clamps. Then after letting that side sit overnight, I came out the next morning and removed all of those clamps. There's a lot of them, so I just sped up the video so you wouldn't get bored. Then, because my handrail overhung the back transom, I took a Japanese pull saw and I cut it flush with the trimmed out back transom. It looked oh so nice and clean. And then I did the same thing to the other side. With my exterior handrails complete, it was time to move on to my interior handrails. Now these are going to be done in pretty much the same way, with a few exceptions. I had to add a few wedge blocks to the bow and stern of the boat for the handrail to terminate into the transom and bow stem. So of course it was back over to the Total Boat epoxy to thin in, no that's not right, wet in the pieces with thinned epoxy and then apply more thickened epoxy. Then I simply clamped my transom wedges in place and waited for them to dry. And then, believe it or not, yep, I clamped my bow wedges in place. And hey, look who I found lurking, the foreman. But he was pretty happy with my work, so I shall continue. One last wedge piece and I will be ready to install my internal handrails. Since I had a little free time waiting for my wedge blocks to dry, I decided to add the last piece of exterior trim to the transom portion of the boat and cover up the remaining visible screws. Now I just did this really easy. I just used thickened epoxy and a 23 gauge nailer to hold the piece in place while the epoxy dried. Oh my gosh, this guy, just trying to steal the show. And also while I waited for those wedge blocks to dry, I took the time to fill the exterior screw holes on the outside panel with a little thickened epoxy mixed with sawdust. This will all get sanded down and painted, and hopefully you'll never even know those screws were there. But before I could actually install the interior handrail, I needed to get all my angles correct. Now this was far trickier than the exterior, because not only did I have the angle at the bow to worry about, I also had to tuck it in by the transom, so there was going to be another angle at the back as well. So again, just using a scrap piece that matched the dimension of my interior handrail, I figured out my angle before cutting it onto my actual piece. Now, like I said, the interior handrail is a little tricky because not only is there an angle at the front and the back, I had to make sure that I cut it at the exact right length so that, you know, it fit nicely and tight. I did not know what to do, so I decided just to purposely cut it long and then slowly just trim it down, fit it, trim it down, fit it, trim it down, fit it, until I got it just right. Remember, I had that nasty mistake installing my chines in the last video, and I did not want to repeat it with another piece that was cut too short. So after cutting my interior handrail roughly to length, I clamped it in place and tried to determine how much needed to be removed. And then I took it over to my contractor saw, trimmed off just a little bit, and then I put it back in. And I did this 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 20 times until it was nice and snug and perfectly fit from my bow to my stern. And the nice thing about boat building is it's the same on both sides, so once you get one thing figured out, usually the other side goes a little bit quicker. But it didn't. I still had to do it about 20 times until it was just right. And with that, it was time to glue it in place. So I removed my clamps, took out the interior handrail, and again I added a nice round over to the entire thing, because you know how I like to round over things. Next, I applied just a dab of thickened epoxy to each rib where the handrail would land, as well as to my transom wedges and my bow wedges. And then very carefully, I maneuvered that handrail into place and slowly just clamped it down. This is where I kind of learned that things don't want to stay where they want to stay when they're under a lot of tension, because yeah, it kept popping out at the bow of the boat. And you'd think I would have learned my lesson and started clamping there and then worked my way the other direction, but no, I just kept letting it pop out until finally I got smart and just left it out until I worked my way up to the bow. And that worked much, much better. The one nice thing with the interior handrails as opposed to the exterior is that because I only needed a clamp on each rib and the wedges, I actually had enough clamps to do both sides at the same time. So after doing one side, I moved over and did the other side, flawlessly I might add, because you know, I learned all those mistakes from the first side. See, look at me, I'm wonderful. And then, just like before, I took an acetone soaked rag and I cleaned up all the squeeze out. Next, I had to add my lag bolts that would go through each rib and hold that interior handrail securely in place. So after drilling a hole, I inserted my bolt with a decorative washer, you know, to make it look all pretty. And I just repeated this step on every single rib. My drill bit was getting kind of hot and smoking, but kind of looks cool, right? Dun 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 dun. Anyways, I drilled all those holes, inserted all my lag bolts, and added a nut to the inside. This nut's really just temporary. These will all eventually get cut off and a cap nut will be put in place. I also couldn't find a wrench, so like a true woodworker, I just used a pair of pliers. You know, because that's the way we do things in a wood shop. This video was sponsored by Squarespace. I have literally had a Squarespace website since I had a business. I got on Squarespace because I was looking for the easiest and most simple way to create a website, and I found that with Squarespace. It was super easy for me to build this beautiful website here. I got my YouTube videos embedded in there. It automatically updates my Instagram feed, and if you want to sell stuff through your website, like I do, you can just upload products, like my $6,000 bespoke palette. Ah, isn't it beautiful? To build a website, all you have to do is go to squarespace.com, click on the Get Started tab. It'll ask you a few questions to determine what website you're trying to build, and then you pick from their vast library of templates. And you just find one that fits your business and make it your own. The other nice thing about Squarespace is that all their websites are optimized for mobile devices, meaning that your content automatically adjusts so your site looks great on any device. With the ability to buy domains directly through Squarespace with no hidden fees, it just makes so much sense to go with Squarespace. So, here's what you're going to want to do. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Do it. Do it now. Now, I was ready for the part I had been waiting for forever. Trimming those ribs flush. If I thought flush cutting the plugs was satisfying, I was sadly mistaken. This by far was the most satisfying part of the entire build. Oh man, doesn't that just clean it up nicely? I could be biased, but I think it looks pretty darn good. And then I moved over to the other side, drilled all my holes, inserted all my lag bolts, added my nuts. Hey, look, I found a wrench. What a smart guy. He can be taught. And then I flush cut all the ribs on that side. Boom, 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 boom. Bazinga. Wacha. Wah. Beautiful. Nice and clean. Yep, that's my muscle. Then to keep the satisfaction ship sailing, I was able to flush cut my transom. This is a little trickier because it was a bigger piece, but I just took my time and boom, it was nice and clean. First I did one side, then I did the other. This will get touched up just with a little bit of sanding, but ultimately this will be the final shape of the transom. And if I can say so, this boat's gonna have a nice rear end. With the transom flush cut, the last thing to flush cut was the actual bow itself. Now this was a little bit trickier. It was a very thick piece. I had to come in at a weird angle and it wasn't perfect. But with a little sanding and shaping, I got it looking quite nice. Ah, yeah. Sorry, there's a lot of awkward sexuality in this video apparently. With my transom and bow cut flush, I sanded down all of my handrails to bring them perfectly even with that piece of plywood. And next, using just a trim router, I added a nice 1/4 inch roundover on each interior space between the exterior and interior handrail. Because, you know me, I love a good roundover. Then after roundovering enough to get my roundover fix, I hand sanded each little piece just to get rid of any chatter or burn marks, and voila. With that, the exterior of my boat is completely constructed. So let's move on to the interior. Now the interior is going to consist of 2 seats, an oarsman's seat and a passenger seat, as well as a front little bow shelf with knee guards that you can stand up and brace your knees against while you fish. I won't quite get to the knee guard in this video, but I will show you the installation of the 2 seats. First, I needed to work on my front passenger seat. Now this seat is a little unique because it's not a fixed seat. It's actually going to slide forward and backwards, allowing you to trim out the weight in the boat depending on how many passengers are riding with you. So the first thing I had to do was install some brackets that would hold a 1/2 inch piece of galvanized pipe that my seat will be hung on, allowing it to slide forward and aft, I guess would be the correct term. So after installing my brackets, I then cut my piece of galvanized pipe. Ah, close-up spark shot. Now I'm a real YouTuber. And then I fit that piece of 1/2 inch galvanized pipe between my 2 brackets. Now my front bracket is solid ash and gets glued and screwed directly to the rib. My back bracket is 3/4 inch marine grade plywood and it will get bolted to the rib. This allows me to remove it, thus removing the pipe and seat if I should ever want to in the future. So after fitting my bracket in place, I drilled through the bracket and through the rib and installed it with some more lag bolts and decorative washers. Then I did the exact same thing over on the other side until my pipe was fit securely in place. Next, I cut the rails that would make up the framework for my seat. As you can see, they just set right on top of that piece of pipe, and once I frame out the seat, they will be able to slide both front to back. I mean, forward and backwards. What's the word again? Aft. Forward and aft. So with my rails cut to the proper length and sliding smoothly, I cut some more pieces of wood and, glued and screwed them together. because that's the theme in this whole boat. Just gluing and screwing stuff together. I am going to plug all these holes though, because you know how I hate screws. And then I tested to see if the framed out seat would fit. And it does. Now this is where I went a little rogue, because the plans say just to slap a piece of plywood on the top and call it quits, but I can never call anything quits. I thought there was an opportunity here to do something a little cooler. So with a little thinking and work, I added a piece of plywood to the top that had cup holders in it. It also had this lift-up storage compartment, and I also made these cool seat backs that are removable but can slide in to give your passengers a more comfortable and luxurious ride. You know, you don't want your passengers to be uncomfortable while they're sitting for hours in a boat on the cold open water. And then I constructed my rear oarsman's seat. This is a much simpler seat to construct because it doesn't have to move. It just gets bolted in between rib number 3 and 4. Not that that means anything to you, but that's what the plan said, so that's why I'm telling you right now. It'll also eventually get a woven rope seat, woven back and forth here across those 1/2-inch galvanized pipes, and be a nice comfy place for me to sit and row the boat. And with that, I know I say this all the time, but it is really starting to look like a boat. I literally have 2 more things to build on this project. The floorboards and that front knee brace guard thing, mabobber. But alas, we are out of time for this video, so that will have to wait for another video. Probably the final video. You guys, I'm almost done with this thing.
Hey, this is the first time I've ever sat in this thing. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. As you can see, I'm getting pretty darn close. There's gonna be 1, maybe 2 more videos left in this build, and that's it. And one of those videos is going to include the final launch. So stick around, stay tuned for the next videos. I will get them out as soon as I can. In the meantime, maybe check out some of these other videos. If you're not doing so, go follow me on Instagram, Facebook. Check out the podcast that I'm a part of, Shop Sounds Podcast. You can find it on all your major podcasting areas. Anyways, good day.